In this, the 13th episode of the spiritual exercises during the quarantine or the social distancing, we come to the passion and the death of our Lord, his arrest, his trial, the way they tortured him, the way of the cross, and his crucifixion and his death. I can't obviously cover all of that in this talk, but I'll encourage you in the page that comes with this that maybe you'll do the Stations of the Cross, or that you'll read the Passion very slowly for yourself, so that you can make it a part of your own. It's such a wonderful Lenten meditation too, and I think the very somberness of it lends itself to this time when so many people are suffering because of the coronavirus, whether ill themselves or dying, or those that are taking care of them at great cost to themselves and great danger, or for those that have lost their jobs or are worried financially, which is just about everybody. And we read the Passion and the death of our Lord, knowing that God is not immune to the suffering of the world. And hopefully you'll find both comfort and inspiration in that. What I'd like to highlight in this brief kind of reflection on Jesus's suffering and death is the three reactions that we discover in the New Testament, in the Gospels, about the suffering Jesus. There is the reaction of greater cruelty. There is the reaction of scandal. There is the reaction of sympathy and compassion. Let's look at each of those at their time. We know that vulnerability can bring with it, for some people, or any sort of weakness, a desire to attack even more, to further exacerbate the suffering. And whether that comes from a desire to distance oneself from weakness, and so the weaker the person is, the stronger one feels, or whether there simply is within us a streak of cruelty that could be called part of the original sin. We don't know. And maybe it comes from other sources, more hidden and dark within our psyches. But we know it is not an unusual reaction. In fact, sometimes our humor is based upon seeing the weakness of others and laughing at that. Jesus seems to have received all of that. They mocked him because he said he was king. And so mocking him, they laughed at him. They piled more abuse upon him. We hear that people cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." It would have been enough simply to have him punished in some ways. But they cried, "Crucify him," and he put up with that. There were a string of both indignities and also of real torture that they put him under. It wasn't enough to torture him to death, but to make the journey towards death as painful as possible. And it's worth noting this because we find that tendency within ourselves. And perhaps Jesus can eradicate that. Perhaps in the forgiveness of Christ, so as we gaze upon the cross and see the blood dripping from his hands and his feet, and his the crown of thorns, his head, and his side, perhaps sensing that forgiveness that he gives to us, it will liberate us to never want to hurt another person through gossip, or through making fun of them, or through whatever other ways we have to delight in the suffering of another person. To see Christ suffering at the hands of others may be the antidote we need to whatever cruelty is within us. And the forgiveness that flows from him hopefully will liberate us from any sort of desire to hold revenge, or to hold anything against anybody. The second reaction to the suffering of Christ is scandal. And that's the reaction of his disciples. They abandoned him there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Peter, when he has a chance of speaking up for him, does the exact opposite. He denies him, denies that he knows him, denies that he's a follower of his. Peter weeps in sorrow for what he has done. But it doesn't change the fact that in this moment of weakness, when the Christ who had ordered him to come upon the waters, who had helped him to distribute miraculously multiplying bread, that Christ was forgotten. And the Christ who was recalled was the Christ who was being beaten and arrested and dragged through the streets of Jerusalem. And Peter, for not wanting to suffer the same fate, denies this Christ. It was a scandal for him. It was a scandal too, in a different sort of way, for the leaders of the people who would call out to him, mocking him as he was on the cross. It was perhaps, we could say, a scandal for the thief who wasn't the good thief, who said, if you are so powerful, save us. It was a scandal for those that, were closest to him and were expecting so much from him, as we see the crowds turn against him so quickly, and they who had accepted him so quickly. And even though nowadays we perhaps understand it wasn't the crowds of Jews who cried against him, the crowds did stay away and didn't support him when he most needed them, as they had done a very short time before. It was scandalous to see him arrested, and all of a sudden, to them, he no longer could be the Messiah that they hoped for. And so whatever happened to him didn't really involve them. They kept their silence and continued on their way. And for us, perhaps Christ continues to be something of a scandal. Perhaps the cross is something that we can't fully embrace. Perhaps we don't really understand what it is that to give all means that we must suffer with him. Perhaps we're not as generous as he calls us to be, because in looking at him on the cross, we know that an immense generosity should spring from our hearts, and we want to hold back. And so we need to gaze upon this cross. We need to read his passion and say, Lord, may I have a deep, deep love for your people and a willingness to follow you in every way I can. The last reaction is one of compassion and of love. And I really invite you, as you pray through the arrest and the trial and the suffering of Christ and his crucifixion and his death, that you approach it with great compassion for Jesus, that you find in yourself a deep love for the Lord, and walk slowly through those passages or through the way of the cross. Walk slowly with your heart open to him. And let, as St. Ignatius would encourage you to do, let the eyes of your mind, of your imagination, follow him, and your heart be right behind your imagination, so that this is not something happening to someone you do not know or care for, but rather his death is happening to someone you care for very, very much, and his suffering makes you suffer because you're with him. I think now of all those who are accompanying in whatever way they can their loved ones suffering from coronavirus. And they're suffering too, even though they themselves may not be dying of the disease or suffering from the effects of it. But the suffering of compassion is a special suffering. And may you embrace this type of suffering as you follow Christ to the cross and to his death. And as you live that out in your prayer, may it bring to you a deep and abiding love for Christ, so that you can, at the end of this, know that what has happened to him has changed you and has allowed you to become so much closer to Him.